Hello students, this is a video lecture that I'm doing for chapter 5 from the textbook. This is about libel defenses. Defenses that journalists and others, particularly journalists, might use. Look at that, that's the Desert View Watchtower. The libel defenses that journalists and others might use in a particular libel case. This watchtower is outside of Hukumba Hot Springs on the way to Centinela State Prison. I'm wearing a Hawaiian shirt here. I've got my badge on, coming from the prison right now. They told me don't wear blue at the prison because you look like one of the incarcerated individuals. Don't wear green, you look like a CO. Don't wear white. I don't know who wears white. Don't wear black for some, no, black was okay. Anyway, there was like a whole list. Oh, don't wear orange. So they would give me a list of colors not to wear, and I said, well, they don't say don't wear a Hawaiian shirt, so I'm wearing a Hawaiian shirt. That's my prison teaching uniform. Okay, here we go. Enough of me. Chapter 5 from the textbook. Chapter 5, libel, the case for the defense. As I've stated, the burden of the proof is on the plaintiff. That means the person who's claiming they were defamed. They have to prove that the libel took place. And there are a number of ways that media outlets or journalists can claim defense. They can argue, and there's a number of different defenses that can be used. That's what we're going to cover right here. I'm going to talk a little bit fast because I want to save time for Jesse Marks. So there's a number of different defenses that a journalist could use. The journalist only has to be successful with one of the defenses for the libel case to be dismissed, okay? So the burden really is stacked in the favor of the journalists. The courts have, again, done that to protect the freedom of the press, and so that we have this active, robust watchdog press. That's why they make it very, very difficult to kind of sue a journalist for libel. But here's just a kind of an overview of some things that if you're a journalist that you've done that will help you in a libel case. If you've done a thorough investigation, if you're not relying on one person material or biased material, if you've really tried to check every kind of element of the story, gotten multiple viewpoints, and if you're rushing to meet a deadline, all that kind of works in your favor and will make a libel case go away. There's something called a strategic lawsuit against public participation, a SLAP. This is a negative term. The term is used to denote when a big corporation like McDonald's or Amazon or ESPN, if they want to sue a small mom and pop operation, they might claim libel or something like that, even though there's no justifiable case whatsoever. But if you have an army of lawyers, you might be able to win in that case. So there's actually anti-SLAP laws. This is discussed in the textbook. Yeah, I'm looking at the textbook right now. Page 179. You don't have to know which state does and which district, which Washington, D.C., whatever. You don't have to know that, but just know what a SLAP is. The purpose of a SLAP is to basically use a lawsuit to kind of threaten someone into silence. The courts don't like to do that. That's why they have these sort of anti-SLAP laws in many states. There is something called the fair report privilege. I'm going to talk about that right now. If you are a journalist and you're covering an official meeting, if you're covering a court hearing, any kind of official proceeding, and you quote verbatim something that's said in the meeting, you are not going to be charged with libel. So if someone is charged with, let's say grand theft, they stole a car, you report according, this court case, so-and-so is charged with theft. You're not libeling them. You're just reporting what was said. Not everything that a cop or a police officer says might be covered by fair report. But in general, if you're quoting from any kind of government recording or a government meeting or something like that, you're going to be okay. Okay, at this point, we've gone over the basics of libel and what constitutes libel. But I brought in a special guest expert to speak to you all for a couple of minutes. I'll let him introduce himself and then share whatever he thinks students ought to know or aspiring journalists ought to know about this topic.
Thanks. I appreciate being here, Professor. Jesse Marks. I'm the student media manager in JMS at SDSU, which means that I advise the Daily Aztec student newspaper as well as KCR College Radio. I've been a professional journalist for about 15 years now, so I have had to familiarize myself with libel extensively, partly through practice, also partly talking to my attorneys over the years. And I think to answer your question, Noah, there are a couple of common mistakes that I see a lot of young journalists making, and that I wish everyone who is walking into the Daily Aztec newsroom knew up front. So some of this your students may already know, but I do think it's just important to emphasize first and foremost that court records and public records are privileged. I'm sure you guys know that, like I said, but I just want to emphasize it because it means that you can cite court records and police records freely without worrying about getting sued for libel. I've actually found over the years that some students are reluctant to write about allegations that are made in a courtroom or in a police record because they tend to view that as being a minefield for libel. And while I respect that caution, I also just need people to know that that's not true. You have more protections in a courtroom than practically anywhere else as a journalist. So seek them out when necessary. They're not always easy to get, but if you need advice on how to gather them up, come talk to me. There are also different helpful guides online. Police records, for instance, are typically withheld by police agencies, but court records themselves are free and accessible. Just make sure that when you do rely on court records or police records to quote them verbatim. And I think this is a very important point because if you're going to paraphrase what is in a document that's privileged, you have to stick very closely to the allegations that are made within them. And you get into trouble when you start interpreting subjectively what is actually in there. You might, in the process, accidentally make an accusation that isn't actually protected. So just be careful.
Okay, wait a minute. When you say privilege, I think I know what you mean. That if someone stands up at like a council meeting and says so and so is a liar, and as a journalist you quote that, that I think is privilege because you're just quoting what was said like at a public meeting. You're not actually saying that yourself. Is that the similar kind of thing where if someone is charged in a court of law, you're quoting verbatim, you're not saying that, you're just saying this is what's happening in the court of law. Is that so you shouldn't be libelous or charged with libel?
Exactly. As long as you stick close to what is being said in the courtroom, because that courtroom is a space where you're supposed to be able to litigate these matters. So you have a certain amount of leeway to quote from those records without getting in trouble yourself because you're not saying it. A prosecutor or a police officer who are agents of the state are saying that. That's why it's protected.
Okay, thank you for that. And you had other points you wish new journalists knew or were aware of?
Yeah, quite a few actually. I have to stress that it's important to talk to everybody who is named in your story because a lot of people don't realize that the side characters in your story, meaning somebody who's not the main subject of your story or a main source, but is mentioned, there's a greater risk for libel there than the subject themselves. The subject of your story will oftentimes be a public figure, which means that you have a lot of leeway to write about them. But sometimes you get into trouble when your side characters aren't public figures, but you mention them. And so I've seen instances over the years where people haven't gone to talk about somebody who is mentioned secondarily, and then that person complains that they didn't get enough room to explain themselves. So just keep that in mind, that the people who might actually complain about your story and threaten you with libel are not the ones you often think they would be. Which I think is another way of just know of saying that every single word and quote in your story you have to be able to stand behind. You're not merely a messenger. You're on the hook for a libelous statement that someone else makes. So be conscious of that. Which brings up another point, which is that how your story, in addition to just worrying about every word that you put in your story and every quote, your story could get you in trouble if it is perceived the wrong way. If you imply something that isn't true, even without saying explicitly, stating some facts explicitly that aren't true. So always be mindful of how a reader might interpret it, not just your sources, because that can get you in trouble. And that even applies to linking. I've actually had this problem over the years where I've linked to other news articles thinking that that was free game. And then somebody reached out and said, no, the article that you linked to is libelous for XYZ reasons. And so you're on the hook for it too. So I've actually had to issue corrections over the years just to remove links. So keep that in mind too, that every word, every link, everything in there, even the way it's perceived can get you into trouble. So just be mindful. But the last thing, no, I would say is that in California, you do have some additional protections that you don't in other states. So if somebody demands a correction or a retraction, they have to do it in writing. and you have 30 days to respond before they can sue you. I've seen reactions that span the spectrum. There's people who will sometimes dismiss those demands and they put themselves at risk even in the face of a letter from an attorney. And I've also seen people panic, apologize, quickly try to correct their stories. My advice to you is just take a breath, but treat every demand for a correction with the seriousness that it demands and own up to your mistakes. I think making mistakes is normal, but what will set you apart from other journalists in the industry is your ability to take accountability and to boost your own reputation as somebody who tells the truth. Even when you're wrong, you're capable of admitting you were wrong. So, does that help?
Now we have something called the Ullman test. And you should definitely look at the textbook, hint, 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 to see what is the Ullman test. Look at kind of the gist of the case that ended up with the Ullman test. It has to do with the distinction between opinion and fact. Opinion is not libelous. Factual statement could be libelous, and the Ullman test is something that the courts use to determine what is opinion and what is a factual statement. Letters to the editor and online comments about a news article are generally considered to be opinion rather than a statement of fact. Here we have this quote, "Slippery shall silvery is out. One of the most corrupt politicians in New York history has been released after serving a small portion of a very lenient sentence." That's something from a letter to the editor. That is an opinion. Shelley Silver could not sue over that statement. Jerry Seinfeld goes on the Letterman show. This was like 15, 16 years ago. And at the time, Jerry Seinfeld's wife had just come out with a book about how to help kids eat healthy food. And there were tricks like, put carrots inside mashed potatoes. Another woman had written a book with very similar tips. And the other woman sues Jerry Seinfeld's wife for plagiarism. Seinfeld goes on the Letterman show, late night talk show, and Seinfeld calls the woman a wacko. The woman who sued my wife is a wacko. That woman then sues Jerry Seinfeld, but the libel suit was dismissed. Jerry Seinfeld won the libel suit, and one of the things the judge said was that you can't sue someone for libel just for hurling an insult. You must show that a person lied about facts in order to damage your reputation in such a way that a reasonable person would have believed those false statements were true. Calling someone a wacko is subjective opinion. It's an insult, but it didn't rise to the level of libel. And then the plagiarism claim that the woman had is pretty unfounded as well. Hiding carrots inside mashed potatoes is, not a unique tip, as it were. The Hustler Magazine v. Falwell case. This is discussed at length in the textbook. You should see that as well. Hint, hint, hint. Hustler Magazine, if you're not familiar with Hustler Magazine, what it was a rather raunchy adult publication. This was not the softcore artistic pornography of something like Playboy. This was more like the serious stuff. They showed it all. So I've heard, okay? I'm only going off what other people have told me, but yeah, Hustler Magazine was pretty extreme, okay? Falwell was a televangelist guy who would go on TV and talk about God and religion, and of course, how you had to give Falwell money. You would raise a lot of money as well. There was an ad campaign for Campari, a type of liquor that would said, my first time having Campari. Hustler Magazine does a version of that where it's my first time having sex, alleging that Jerry Falwell has had sex with his wife and his mom. Jerry Falwell had sex with his mom in an outhouse, and that was his first time having sex. Hustler Magazine won the libel case for this reason of rhetorical hyperbole, that it was so absurd. It was so absurd that no one would possibly have believed it, and even the claims of emotional distress were unsuccessful because Falwell was a public figure. And as we've established with Times v. Sullivan, public figures have a much, much higher standard when trying to prove libel. Section 230. Now, this is confusing. I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but take a look at the textbook. Section 230 from the Communications Decency Act offers immunity to internet service providers and some websites and libel claims. The idea is that if you host a website and you publish user-generated content, or if you run a social media platform and you host posts from other people, what those other people say might be libelous, but you, as the platform or internet service provider, are not going to be sued for libel. And there's a whole host of things that are covered. Even some behavior that's really kind of reprehensible can be covered by Section 230. If you distribute the content, don't create the content, if you don't interact directly with the content, if you don't materially change the content. All right, take a look at that in the textbook. Now, a wire service defense. I'm going to play some sounds right here. This is the sound that a wire machine would make. The Associated Press is a wire service. We also have UPI, I think that's United Press International. There's some other wire services as well. These things were formed well over 100 years ago, maybe 150 years ago, when newspapers realized that it didn't make sense for like all the newspapers in New York City to pay to send someone down to Mexico to cover the war in Mexico, and they all would pay to send messages back via telegraph. You had to pay for every telegraph message. All 7 reporters are sending basically the same messages. So the Associated Press was formed, where people would get together and one reporter maybe goes overseas, maybe goes to a faraway location. That one reporter then files news that every newspaper who subscribes to the wire service can use. And once you start paying attention to this, you'll notice that a lot of news in local newspapers, including the San Diego paper, is not actually from anyone employed by the San Diego Union Tribune. It's employed by a wire service. Okay, and when I was younger, I did work in my college radio station in the 1980s. We had one of these Associated Press wire service machines, and they would kind of sit in the corner of the newsroom, corner of the radio station, corner of the television station or newspaper, wherever, and kind of be running almost continuously, making the sound that you hear in the background. And there's a strip of paper coming through continuously with news on it. Short bullet points, very short. There's a fire here, there's a car crash there, there's, a war here, that kind of thing. And if you didn't have any news reporters actually working for your outlet, like I worked at the campus radio station, then you could go over and just rip off a piece of paper and start reading it, and you'd be reasonably assured that the information was true. Rip and read is considered very, very sloppy journalism. You just rip and read, meaning you don't do any sort of independent fact checking yourself. But many, many agencies operate in that same manner and continue to use this kind of thing. So the lecture notes in the textbook talk about the wire service defense. If you are a small newspaper, say in rural Alabama, let's say Wetumpka, Alabama. You're supposed to say Wetumpka, not Wetumpka, because I've been told Wetumpka makes you sound like a redneck. Wetumpka is the more respectable way to say that town in Alabama. Newspaper in Wetumpka, Alabama, there's a story coming over about a fire in Paris, and it was started by so-and-so, and you rip and read, and you post that information in your newspaper. Turns out it's false, that one person named in the story didn't actually start the fire. That person cannot come and then sue the Wetumpka Gazette. The argument being, we got it from a reputable news service. We are immune from the libel claim. So that is what we mean by a wire service defense. Now we also have this case. This is not in the textbook, but this happened in the early, I think 1904, early 1900s. Annie Oakley was really, really good at the rifle. She would perform in Wild West shows. I wanted to say she was a marksman, but I realized that's a very sexist term. She's a good sharpshooter, and she would perform in these Wild West shows. How good she could shoot things. Anyway, she was like a celebrity, the equivalent of a big celebrity in 1904. Someone was impersonating Annie Oakley. I guess it was easier to impersonate people in 1904 before the internet. You could just show up and say, hey, I'm Annie Oakley. People couldn't Google and look up the actual photograph. Anyway, this person is impersonating Annie Oakley, and the impersonator stole someone's pants in order to buy cocaine. Yeah, I think that was the allegation. They stole someone's trousers in order to buy cocaine. And this story was reported widely all in these newspapers as the real Annie Oakley, didn't realize it was an Annie Oakley impersonator. And then Annie Oakley went around and tried to sue every single newspaper that had made this libelous claims about her because she had not actually stolen a man's pants to buy cocaine. She won a couple of cases, but I think she spent more. So I heard she spent more money on lawyers than she actually got. But a wire service defense came out later. If the wire service defense had existed, Annie Oakley would not have been able to go around and try and sue all these newspapers. Some other defenses mentioned in the textbook are the single publication rule. Check that out. And then we also have libel proof plaintiff. What we mean by this is if your reputation is so poor, so bad, so horrible, nothing that anyone says about you could possibly damage your reputation even more. This libel proof plaintiff rule has come into effect with some mobsters, people who were like convicted of murder and organized crime and extortion. The idea is that, you're in jail for murder. Someone says you committed a murder. Even if that person is wrong, your reputation is already so poor that nothing that they say against you is going to hurt you even more. I just find that to be kind of an amusing defense, the libel proof plaintiff. Okay, that's it. I tried to talk fast because I wanted to get time to get Jesse Marks in there. And that is the end of chapter 5.